questions. And it was a weird tightrope to have to walk, So in answer to your question, yeah, I mean, it was sort of in preparing myself. Ed was always the same with me. He was always really open. I think Ed would have talked about anything with me, which is another reason why I had to be careful when I asked him, or in what he told me, because he would kind of sometimes say stuff and I knew I couldn't use that stuff, and I never did until much later. And we'll get into that in a moment. So yeah, it was that. It wasn't so much the content of the interview. It was just more the personality of it, and trying to divorce myself from being Edward's friend and now being this journalist. And it was sometimes a little awkward, though Ed never made me feel that way. But sometimes it got a little weird. But I don't think that came through in the interviews. I think the interviews came through as people getting a sense of this connection between Ed and I, and digging or hopefully digging the interviews.
Absolutely. Well, I want everybody to know that Steve has finally done something that I have been waiting my entire life, waiting for him to do. I've been reading Steve since I was a kid. I used to read Steve in all the different magazines growing up, and this is something that I wish someone would have done, and now he has done it himself. So Steve has written a book on Ed that he has been working on for many, many months, and he has culminated his interviews, and he has put them all together, which he, I believe, is self-publishing, correct?
That's correct.
All right, that's right. And it's is there a name for the book yet?
No, man, I keep going back and forth. I had a tentative working title of, something like Edward Van Halen, A Life, was his sort of a poetic little thing, meaning, what an incredible life he led. And then some kind of a little tagline of my 26-year journey with Edward Van Halen. Those are kind of, working ideas. I've been kicking around a few more, but I mean, nothing is fixed in stone yet.
I got one for you. You ready?
I'm ready.
Van Rosen.
I love it.
Dave will only ask for 5% of the initial book sale.
Hey, listen.
There you go.
Hey, listen. I'm going to tell you right now. I gave Greg the title to his book for Ted Templeman. That was written by me, and I got no credit in the book.
Oh, that rat!
I know Greg's a good guy, and he did a great job.
No, he is great.
I just love. I'm just breaking balls.
So, Steve, I have to ask you, because we've had quite a few people on the show who've written books on Eddie Van Halen or Van Halen in general, and quite a few.
Have you really?
Yeah.
Who have you guys talked to?
Okay, so obviously we've had Greg on multiple times. We've had Kevin Dodds on as well. We've had just recently on the guy who just put out the Unchained book, the Eddie Van Halen story, which is Paul Brannigan, which is known as Eruption, the Eddie Van Halen story overseas. And we also had on Michael Christopher, who put out Van Halen, the Eruption, and the Aftershock. And then we also had the two gentlemen from Guitar World who put out Eruption, their combined works of their interviews with Brad Tolinsky and Chris.
And we actually had the guy who wrote the Van Halen Encyclopedia.
Yeah, we had him on. C.J. Chilvers. Yeah, we had him on.
Right.
Yeah.
But my question is, so with all those people we just listed, and most of them have had books that came out or are coming out in the last few months or about to come out. So how does your book stand out from the other books? What do you say to a diehard Van Halen fan who thinks they know everything already, and why should they go read your book?
That's a question I asked myself over the course of the last 14 months. I began the book actually on my birthday, 2020, August 24th. So that was, a month and a half or so before Ed passed. I have to back up a little bit here. Many of you may know, or some of you may know, or maybe none of you know. Back in 1985, I was going to write Edward's authorized biography. By 85, he was the king of the world, guitar-wise. And I knew that somebody was going to write a book on him. And I thought, I don't believe there's anybody on the planet who knows Edward better than I do, So he and I actually signed some contracts, and I actually still have those contracts. They're very simple one-page contracts, and you'll see those in the book. And for the next 4 years, maybe more, I started interviewing everybody, friends, band members, And for one reason or another, Edward would never commit. I think Ed was afraid of the book in a way that said that he always told me that books only come out on people when their career is over. And I said, Ed, that's not true. And I tried to explain to him that that is not true. But that's how he always felt. And I mean, I tried to push him, and we get together. I said, Ed, let's sit down, man. Let's knock out the interviews. Because as much as I interviewed him, I still had to interview him specifically to the book. I had, so much stuff that I wanted to talk to him about.
Yeah, of course.
And I could just never get him to do that. So at a point in time, I let that go.
So are you incorporating the interviews you did for his biography into your current book?
That's exactly what I did. Well, I take that back. So fast forward, Ed and I stopped seeing each other in 2003, and I write about that in the book. So for, 17 years, I never spoke to Ed. And in fact, I never spoke to him again after 2003. And I never had any intentions of ever writing that book. I thought, hey, Ed didn't want to do it. I was going to respect that. I just didn't have it in me to go and try and resurrect it. But something in me said, you have a story here that nobody else has, and it needs to be told. And, some voice said to me, it would resonate with fans. So that's when I started working on the book again on August 24th, my birthday. And for the next 14 months, I kept writing. And at the end of 14 months, I had this book. So as a little backstory, in answer to your question, what makes my book different than every other writer out there? And those are excellent writers. Brad Talinsky, I worked with Brad. When he was at Guitar World, I actually did an interview with Ed for him. Chris Gill. I mean, those guys are excellent writers. A lot of those guys who wrote those books are tremendous writers. And they have a vast, vast knowledge of Ed, and their interviews sort of cover. For the first record, Brad's and Chris's book, I guess, begins somewhere in the 90s. I've only read parts of the book. It's an excellent book. I don't think they go all the way back to the 70s interviewing Ed. And in fact, I'm pretty sure they don't. So again, what makes my book different? The fact that I was friends, that I saw this guy or talked to this guy every other day for probably the better part of 17 or 18 years. That I had 50 hours doing actual interviews with him. But in between, I was hanging with the guy. I mean, as well as these other writers knew Edward and knew the history, I couldn't begin to try to match Greg Renoff with his history of the early days of the band. I didn't have that kind of a relationship with Ed. I wanted to talk to Ed about, his early life and growing up in Amsterdam and, what kind of food did he eat and, what did he learn in school? And there was so much I wanted to talk to him about. But, Greg covered all that. My book doesn't do nearly that kind of in-depth job. I believe I knew Edward in an intimate way that no other writer ever did. And I know that he allowed me to write that initial book because he trusted me. And he told me many times that there's no other writer that he could think of that he would ever allow to write the book. There was nobody but me. And I talk about that in the book. Edward's on tape saying those things. It's difficult for me to say why my book is different without making it sound like I'm saying my book is better. And I'm not saying that at all. These other books each have their own credibility. And, you can learn the history of Van Halen infinitely better from those books than mine. My book doesn't do that. I talk about some of the dates when the records came out, some of the shows in L.A. It's not a chronology. It's not an overview of Ed's guitars. It's not an insightful look at his playing. It's not talking about the tapping or the, flutter picking. It's somebody who was friends with this guy from 77 before the first record came out, before he was this god on earth. And he was still basically a local kid, a Pasadena kid, made very good. I saw that rise. I was there. Him talking to me about that first record and playing me the tracks before they came out on the second record and the third record and the fourth record, and his insecurities, and talking about his family and the relationships with Dave and Michael and Alex and his family and his father. I believe that there is stuff that he told me that he never told any other writer. And he told me those things, like I said before, trusting that I would never reveal those things. And I didn't. Like I said, a lot of that stuff, I never included any of that stuff in those interviews. Well, going back, and starting the book, I gathered all of my tapes, and I was a pretty good documentarian. I was pretty good at labeling things, or so I thought, and dating things. Well, then there were tapes, and there were no dates on them. And so to assemble the chronology of these interviews in an order that made sense, there were some conversations that had no dates. So I'm not sure where to insert them in sort of my history with Ed. So I'd have to kind of hear the tape, and Ed, would say something, or I would say something, and I go, oh, fuck, that was after the third record, and I was a detective detecting my own clues. Man, in a short answer, nobody else spent the amount of time with Ed that I did. I don't think any other writer was ever a friend with Edward like I was. What I hope and I believe that I have captured all of that in the book. It's extraordinarily honest, and I lay myself out there, and I lay Edward out there, and there's nothing hidden. I have no agenda. I mean, I love the guy. I really loved him as much as I revered and awed him. And that was a difficult line to walk all the time, hanging out with this guy, Eddie Van Halen, or having him play guitar at your house. And I knew it. I sensed it. I had been around enough guys to know this guy is going to be, if he's not already, the most influential guitar player in history. I'm not saying he was the greatest guitar player. That's an impossible measurement to make. Was he greater than Jimmy Page or Jimi Hendrix? I mean, that comes down to personal. I mean, that's a ridiculous argument to have. But influential, because Ed, sort of grew up during the digital age, and now instead of, 100,000 people hearing his music, there was 1 million people or 5 million people. Yeah, I think he had the heaviest influence of any guitar player ever. So to have him sitting there smoking cigarettes in the house, cigarette smoke would cause me to get migraines. Oh. And he'd come over, man, and he'd smoke like a chimney. And I never told him to stop smoking. But I mean, that's just a little wrinkle. But realizing who he was and trying not to just sit there and just be in awe of the guy and just trying to be a normal friend, that was a difficult thing to do. I mean, I did. It wasn't like every moment it was like I was gasping for breath. But that was a tough thing to do. So seeing those moments, being involved in moments in him that no other writer ever had or ever saw or ever shared in, having him talk about his dad, seeing things that I know other writers didn't see. I think that's what my book has. And again, man, I really hope, and I tried as hard as I possibly could to capture all of that and put it out there on the page, and trying to describe to the reader what it was like to sit there in my little Hollywood Hills guest house with Edward sitting on the couch, playing me songs from the third record before the third record came out. And him, playing these riffs. I didn't know what they were. I mean, I didn't know what the songs were. I only knew that these riffs were so fucking unbelievable. On his guitar, guys, once in a while he'd bring over one of his guitars, or sometimes he'd play it. I had a Strat and I had a Les Paul. Or he'd pick up my guitar and just playing my guitar. And man, when you're that close, watching a guy playing an electric guitar, unplugged, I mean, you can really sense how fucking good the guy is. And it's like he was Edward Van Halen, man. I mean, he sounded like Edward Van Halen on my Strat, on my Les Paul. I mean, these riffs were just mind-blowing. And I just kind of sit there. And a couple times I'd sit there and I wouldn't say anything when he was done because I was just so fucking blown away. I had never heard riffs like that. I'd never heard guitar playing arrangements done like that, So, he'd get done and I'd just kind of be sitting there and I'm recording the whole thing. And he'd kind of get done and he'd go, I thought they were pretty neat. What they neat? Neat was his way of saying, man, I think that we're fucking cool, don't you? It was like he was asking for my approval. Like, dude, didn't you think they were fucking great? Weren't you blown away? I thought they were neat. It shows such a human side of the guy, that he could even think that way. And so I'm trying to explain all this that happened, whatever it was, 78, so when I'm writing this book, 88, 98, 30 whatever years later, so an audience can understand my feeling, how my heart was racing, what I was hearing in that moment. There were just so many of those moments, and I don't think any other writer ever experienced those kinds of moments. And I think that's what you'll get, or hopefully you'll get when you read my book.
I can't wait for it. So now, in terms of your book, where are you going to sell it? When are you going to sell it? When is it going to be ready?
Those are all good and kind of unknown questions. I am going to self-publish So I'm writing and I'm writing and I'm writing, and I had written 7 books previously, and they were difficult books, and this one was 1,000 times more difficult than all 7 of them put together. Typically, a book like